Hello and welcome back to 2022. Brand new year, same old stuff really. What's been happening in the PlayBASIC world? Well, not a lot. There's been a lot of things for me personally that have changed, but I'll touch on that some other time, I guess. Let's have a look at the forums. I think recently given the New Year's period, I normally make a New Year's demo. That's down here somewhere in the source code area. Includes all the code down the bottom. See a larger version of the picture. So the PV part of the animation is produced with just particles, and the text overlay is distorted and bent. And then it's re-distorted in the output process as well. So there's two distortions happening at once. One of it's done during the render, and one of it's done during the output of the video. Just turn the audio off for that. The front part is actually just stock videos, and this part here you would have seen before, and that's just overlaid with some sort of some champagne glasses, I guess. The background photography is actually around where I live. They were taken last year mostly, except for the one picture here. That's at a local lake, and that's from New Year's Eve. From Christmas Eve at our local lake as well. It's what the Christmas photo was taken from. Anyway, the code for that's down the bottom. As you can see, we've just posted every year when I make one, I just post the same thing. It is different than last year's. This one runs in full HD, so it's rendering a frame that's full HD and then scaling it down to whatever your display size is to view this thing, which is a handy way of working. If you want to render something that's bigger than the screen but have your display be able to see it on screen, it's kind of frustrating. Other source codes that were put up in recent times, let's have a little look. These are in December. This is a sine wave variant. Alright, so we've got our code, paste across into PB, just run it, F5. This is drawing sine text distortion, but without... the classic way of doing this is you render out the piece of text to a graphic, and then you run through and you take the graphic and you draw it strip by strip, either in vertical columns or horizontal rows. This is not doing that. This is actually just... look through it. Where are we? I'll show you text down the bottom here. We're drawing each row of the text at an offset. We're using the viewport controls to limit where it's been drawn. So we're setting the viewport up to be one row in height and drawing a text relative to that viewport. So we can draw, it looks like we're drawing a row out of that bit of text. And the same thing works for doing it in vertical columns here as well. I think there's a control up here to change the size. Alright, so we'll change it to 32. You'll sort of notice now we've got like columns of 32 pixels up and down. It's not quite as noticeable as oh, there it is, you can tell there. This column here is moving independently of this column beside it, so they're shifting at different sections. So it's not actually doing the wave on a per pixel basis, doing blocks of like 4 pixels wide or 2 pixels wide. That was used in the New Year's Eve demo. That's why I posted it. This one here is a bit of code for grabbing something. I think this is doing... it's a variation of just downloading a file. The first version uses the internal HTML library, and the second version uses an API function which lets you download from things like not just HTTP sites but encrypted servers as well. And it's as simple as just dropping in a function call and then calling it yourself. You do have to sort of manage what's going on, but there's nothing much to it. And you can sort of drop that into other bits of code where you need to download something that they're not in the background. When you make the call, it will stop your application, it will do the download, and then once it's finished, it returns back to your application. So it's synchronous, it's not asynchronous. But can be handy. What else we got? Echoes, motion blur. Back in November. Particle collision demo. Yeah, just play the video for this one. So we've got a simple map, we've got some particles with gravity applied to them. There it is. The code's on the forum here, so it uses the internal mapping solution, uses the, there's a detection function for mapping libraries to do collisions with the maps, to do sliding collisions with the maps, which here it's just called check map impact, and we just use that. The rest is just blended straight to the back buffer. Nothing special at all, actually. But it makes for a fun little demo. That's there for you to have a go at. Some intersection code for some reason. Most of the main conversations we're having in recent months have been between Scott and Steve, doing various different things. What have we got here? This is the Mode 7 stuff, that's right. Like Mario Kart games, those classic Mario Kart games. Drawing a perspective, seemingly never-ending scene. Made a helper video about that, about how you might buffer the texture for Mode 7. The initial versions here are doing it pixel by pixel, so we're actually doing a calculation every single pixel on screen and fiddling around with sort of ways of improving that render throughput. So if you render a large frame buffer, even on a modern computer in PlayBASIC, that's going to be pretty slow to draw pixel by pixel. Just look for something in there that... I think that one's mostly about theory, about ideas of how you might make that inner loop faster by removing iterations, by calculating 2 pixels per scan line per loop rather than 1, for example. And then Steve's talking about using the strip functions to do the same thing, which is really what the strip functions were there for, but they have one obvious issue, is that they don't do UV wrapping, which is how the original demos work. Well, I assume back in the day that's how demos work. What I mean by that is that when you're drawing a strip to draw this perspective scene, you can give it these UV coordinates that are outside of the texture, and it will wrap those UV coordinates to be inside the texture regardless of where this line fragment is coming from. So you can just kind of go, hey, draw a line between these 2 points, and on screen it's going to be this size here, and it just does the magic for you. In PB we can't do that because it has clipping of those elements. So Steve was messing around with doing using the strip approach, and it turns out you can get it to run, rather than sort of low teens, by doing it pixel by pixel, brute forcing it, you can get it to run at over 100 frames per second, pretty comfortably. Which is an example of the thing there. It turns out the number of strips that you need to render from different textures is quite low. And this would be, in this screen here for example, as each horizontal line is being drawn, see how we've got this position 1, position 8. Well, this would be the texture boundary here. So this right hand side of the screen is drawn with one strip call, and the left hand side of the screen is drawn with another strip call there. As you get further away from the camera, it's probably 2 or 3 times when it's being repeated. So it takes, rather than looping every individual pixel, just thousands and thousands of times, all of a sudden you're only doing maybe a few hundred loops, maybe 500 loops. So huge throughput benefit. And those render strip commands are much faster doing the same thing. Bit of a demo of it running. I hope this is what it is. Yeah. Just me driving around the environment, having fun. What you could do is you could wrap this up into a library. In other words, a set of functions that do the display process, that can do overlaying characters onto the environment. They handle all the math side of it. And the user just goes, well, load world or create world or whatever you would call it. And then have other functions for creating the characters within the world. And then you just, through the library, you interface with moving those characters and doing that stuff. You can position the character somewhere, attribute what sprite, what graphical image is going to be, and the library works out things like collisions for you and what's in front of the camera and how to do all that good stuff. So you get to focus on the AI aspect and the game aspect rather than the display aspect. And that would work great for things like building a Mario game, for example. I know we're talking about Mario Kart here, but I'm talking about traditional 2D platformers where you could have a library that you just include the library, Mario library or whatever it's going to be, and the user just calls these kind of high-level functions that create the display engine, do all that stuff behind the scenes, and when you need to draw the screen, you just call draw screen. It works out what part of the screen's visible, how to load the graphics, how to set up the maps, all that stuff for you. You just so then you're left to do the actual control code for the behaviors in the game. Which is kind of how PB started its life, actually. It wanted to be more of... There's a lot of conversation early on about having this scripting, internal scripting for what we were calling entities back then, which never made their way into the libraries. It was just a way of taking a bunch of primitives and sticking them all together to make something that acted as one thing. That's all it was. And then you thought, well, geez, if I had external control over that, then I could make my little program, give the program to someone else, and they could modify and make additions to this without me having to modify the program every time a change is made. So which is that kind of externalization of data problem. Conceptually it's harder for people to wrap their head around. How do I program something? How I externalize certain information that can be modified by, let's say I've got a friend of mine doing the artwork, and he wants certain changes made. Then I have to fire up PlayBASIC, make the changes to the original program, recompile the executable, send it back to him. Whereas if the changes he's asking for are done externally, he could check what that looks like himself, and without me ever having to modify the program. So if you can wrap your head around externalizing data, very, very big positive. Now if we had having libraries that could do this kind of stuff, and they wouldn't be that complicated to write, most of the functionality is already built into PlayBASIC. The trick is actually getting people to use the library, isn't it? Most people, a lot of coders would go, no, I don't want to use someone else's pre-existing chunk of code because it doesn't do something that I need. That'll always be the issue you run into. Anyway, so these guys have been doing a bunch of other stuff here. Chat about some Asteroids Remake. Steve went and rendered out some nice nice graphics for it. Actually, that's really nice, isn't it? I think it was more of just a mess around for Scott. 3D on the fly, I'm not quite sure what that is. Various Wolfenstein revisions. The floor technique that's used in the Mode 7 demo is the same kind of floor rendering that occurs that's used in raycasting. Right. Jumping into this now, I'm not quite sure what we're looking at next. So I know this demo was running a while ago. Scott's had a few goes at making raycasters. I think we're talking about doing... I would have thought you'd just have an animated texture for a door. You would need transparency then, wouldn't you? So if you just render... If when you open a door, you're showing it an alternate texture, and that texture's the door texture rendered to that frame. So you've got the door texture being rendered to your temporary texture, and it's been cleared out each time it's been... So as it's moving up or moving down, yeah, we're just offsetting the texture to move it up, and offsetting it down to move down. Now, but it has a transparent color, so color 0 or whatever you would use would be the transparent part. I'm not quite sure how well that would fit into how PB works. You might have to pre-render the buffer, as in render all the transparent fragments to a secondary buffer and then do a transparent blit of that over the top of the foreground blit. And because the depth is already worked out, that should work fine. That would go for characters as well, actually. So the characters will be overlaid. It's like two separate planes. The background plane, or plate, you would call it in video editing, or layer, I guess, and a foreground layer for characters, and then just composited together at the end. Because we're doing the casting, we're inside this maze. You can never see a point where the camera's occluded by anything. If you know what I mean. Probably should do a demo of that. And I saw this other demo here for... Oh, this is actually on the Amiga. But that's the kind of thing I imagine that if you wrote... Again, if you took what people have been working on lately, set it up as a library, and as in a bit of code you include into your project, you adopt the rendering loop that it uses, and then you just have control over where characters are placed within the world, what you're doing with things, etc. Then that's how people could jump into and start up a quick project. So most of these blogs we talk about, where we are with things and what has happened in recent times. Now, those people who followed the conversation at all the last handful of years would know that I've been a full-time carer for a long time. Now that has actually ceased. Since then, my role has changed quite dramatically. I don't have a full-time thing to do. Nonetheless, the questions keep coming in about, the future of PlayBASIC. What do I see the future of PlayBASIC being? Well, it's hard to answer. It doesn't have a future if people don't use it. You can't keep telling people there's going to be a new version coming, because that's just a never-ending game of chasing your own tail. So we had the future of PlayBASIC question a year ago. Spent a bunch of time making videos and trying to talk people through the problems of that. Look, I guess people think I'm probably overtly negative, and in my normal life, my everyday life, I sort of am. I don't tend to think these things will they won't sort of be brought back to life by some sort of miracle. It'll be a lot of hard work that gets them over the line. Yes, there's a lot of conversation in here about like a 2-hour blog video about all kinds of aspects of PB. And it just keeps coming back up. It's the same thing. I mean, it's not a new thing. It's been asked a bunch of times, and even when we started, People are like, where's this going? Well, we don't know. I mean, the longer term, you can't possibly answer that. You have basic ideas about where you'll be in, 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years, maybe. But 10 years, no. This question comes up a lot, what's the future of this thing? You put something out there and people want to know if they can depend on this going into the future. Well, we had initial plans that were, in the shorter term, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. We didn't have plans that were 20 years into the future. No one, including myself, thought I'd be standing here talking about PlayBASIC 20 years later. Absolutely not. I have a lot of ideas I would like to implement into it. Anyway, so these kind of questions keep coming through all the time. Every year or so, they get the same sort of fragment, or the same kind of ideas keep being reiterated, even though they've been answered before. Here it's like, hello, I'm curious, are there any plans to make PlayBASIC free? It's been free for 10 years. What we call the Learning Edition is completely free. It has one modification to it. It doesn't have the linker included. If it did, basically you're just giving away the whole thing. There's no point having a free version and a retail version. And this is the same argument that's made when we were, actually it's longer than 10 years ago. This would be about 2006, 2007. We had a timed demo that was available. It was 120 days of demo. And it actually took the amount of time that you compiled and subtracted that from the overall time, which actually meant that for most people, if you're a heavy user, it would probably expire within the 120 days. For other users, it probably would never have expired. It hasn't been updated for a long time, and that's a mistake. It needs to be updated. It needs to be maintained in such a way that it keeps pace with the current changes that have been made to PlayBASIC. So there are differences between the free builds and the current retail builds. That's just what happens over time. We add more libraries to the background, give away more stuff to people, and no one gives a shit, really. No one really cares, Anyway, it's the same thing. It's like, oh, well, if it's free, there'll be more people. If you don't participate in the community that you're trying to build, then why are you worried about it? It makes no sense to me. As I said, there's been a free version out for a long time, blah, blah, blah. Ordinary people may think the Learning Edition is not a complete edition. It's the full version, except you can't build executables with it. That's the only difference, right? So all the same code works, right? All the same features are still included in it. They're all still there. You just can't build executables. A bigger community will be better. I want to see PlayBASIC have a big community. Well, again, what's your strategy for doing that? So my response to that was pretty much, here he's saying people may think the Learning Edition is not a complete edition. And my response was, well, most ordinary people today have no idea what BASIC is. They don't. When I was a kid, it was a part and parcel of every home computer. If you were an 8-bit person, you're exposed to BASIC. The moment you hit the power switch, bang, there was some sort of BASIC prompt, flashing at you. And through the end of the 80s into the 90s, that was still there. Pretty much, you've got the 16-bit era, so you've got things like in the Amiga scene, you've got Amos, Blitz BASIC, this kind of stuff. As we move into 2000, those users that remember that stuff were still interested in programming, but on the PC. Hence why things like, PlayBASIC, BlitzBasic, DarkBasic, Pure Basic, Power Basic. There's a whole plethora of these things. Love 2D exists. It just goes on and on and on. A bunch of them were spawned around the same time. But cast your mind forward to today, 20 years beyond that point, right, where people are, my age, in their 50s, a young person who has a curiosity for developing a game today, does not know the term basics. It's just not a term people are aware of. They don't teach it in schools anymore, because it's not object oriented generally. I say generally, there's a few versions that are. So things like, Python, for example, and these days, just even JavaScript is where people program. The next part here comes back to the same question. A bigger community will be better. So my response was, apart from a free version, what's your big idea then? And more importantly, who's paying for it? If you're talking about trying to write competitive products today to products that were built 20 years ago, and have had 20 years of revision, I mentioned before Love 2D. Love 2D is one of the oldest products I can think of that is basic-like. Well, I haven't looked at it for a long time. Has built-in physics, etc. It's free, it's multi-platform, it's done all that stuff, and it's been around forever. Right? And it's free. So, where's your incentive to go and tackle that? And moreover, why would someone who is using that product today, why would they uproot themselves to move to a different product that's less mature? I just can't get there for that there. If you go look at these products, they tend to be infrastructures. They tend to do, I won't pick anyone out in particular, but once you've got a user using your tool, you want to have all of the secondary tools built around your product as well. So they're kind of stuck in your personal infrastructure. They don't need to go elsewhere to do something. And that's a big task. To make something that can be generalized well enough to do a good subsection of 2D products and then moving to 3D, it's not that easy to do. And as you can see, the last 20 years, there's a whole list of these dead products that couldn't get traction, that people spent years building and got nowhere. So without sort of clearly defining what this person thinks that should be in the product, it's not beneficial. And I don't really care if people criticize PB. I actually don't. I couldn't give a shit. Because its use by date was 10 years ago. The things that I feel like, that are worth doing have been, they've been put out there a bunch of times. Talking about things like pre-processing stuff and even macro kind of features in things. And here we've got questions about media ranges. Do you need this kind of stuff? And I kind of know the answer. The answer is basically you don't. That covers the basic stuff in the forums. It covers what we've been doing, what people have been doing in recent months. All right, I guess where this brings us to this uncomfortable situation where we're in 2022, we have no real direction about what's going to happen in the future. There are things I want to do, and I have to work out where that fits within my own life. It's a difficult thing to work out. Like the things I want to do, I've hinted at these things before. I want to update the compiler, kind of implementing the stuff that I wanted to do when back in the day, pretty much. And I don't think it matters now that BASIC is not BASIC anymore. BASIC can be kind of weird derivatives of itself. You can do whatever you want with stuff. The stuff I would go for and implement would be some of these kind of pre-processing stuff and making it a bit smarter in many regards. Look at what APIs we're supporting. Which is all just the back end stuff, how things actually get implemented behind what you call. So when you call open screen, what kind of screen is that setting up? Is it OpenGL, DirectX, which it won't be, GDI, Vulkan these days? Those kind of questions, which just adds secondary questions as well. If you support one, like a newer technology like Vulkan, which you might get high performance from, but even having a BASIC that can take advantage of threading, that is designed not to be single core all the time, so it can share the workload across what you're doing. That would be a huge benefit to most people, because multi-core systems have been around for a long time now. Even if you have a simple rendering engine that just does software rendering, for example, but you could shift the bulk of that workload to the second processor and off the back of the logic processor. That acts as your graphics card. There are some older demos on the forums that show a threaded GDI demo from 10 years ago, probably more than that now. It has like 30,000 sprites just bouncing around the screen with 50% alpha blending. And this is just done in software. That demo actually worked pretty well on my old Athlon system, for example, which meant you could. That's a single core system, and because it's using GDI, when you do a high priority thread, that's like a new slice. So you're actually you're getting much more benefit from the processor in those systems. Then on multi-core systems, you're getting this parallel effect. So you can render this portion of the screen in parallel with across maybe 2 threads or 4 threads or whatever it would be. So you could have threaded rendering, threaded data management stuff, threaded stuff to do, whether it's physics on the background or whatever. I mean, most of those libraries are written to work that way anyway. We wouldn't have to do any of that. You just pull in Box2D, set up your interface for it, and Bob's your uncle. It's pretty ugly, to be honest, but that's just how those things go. These are big questions, and they're the kind of things that turn people on or off, They can't be done quickly, and they can't be done really without having a definitive idea of what this thing's meant to design to be solving. You could just make PB, like PB could just become, PB could just be, it could have no core command sets at all beyond stuff like math and string. You have like math string and some disk support. Basic sort of OS. Basic OS. So for handling things like input devices and the screen itself, having a version of the screen, some sort of display mechanism. So what PB could be is pretty much a basic to C translate. So in the background you've got like a mini C compiler. The PB compiler here is producing, it's taking the basic and stripping it down and converting that to C, which means you can have things like inline C. It sounds fancy, but it's not really that fancy at all. Or inline assembly in your applications. Whoa, that sounds incredibly fancy. How powerful is that? It's almost meaningless because pretty much C compilers have that stuff built into them. Since you're just pre-processing your code, laying it out into C fashion, throwing it into your average C compiler, you get those things as a byproduct. Now, it doesn't mean that we need to do some So clean-up work with the basic code to get it to compile in C, that's a different conversation altogether. But it's possible. People have been doing this for ages. And a lot of high-level languages translate to C anyway. What that does, it means it keeps them in a world where you can build, you can pretty much select what target you want this thing to compile onto, and the compiler and the actual binary generation are nothing to do with each other. So all you need to do then is make sure these basic libraries here are deterministic. They work across the different targets, which is pretty much, in C terms, just like the standard library stuff. That's what that stuff's there for. You could do that. That's probably not that difficult to do, to be honest. Or even if you go, what we talked about before and what we've already done is the basics we're calling it like HTML. It's actually JavaScript. And people use, there's infrastructures now that do a lot of this kind of stuff for you. You can do this kind of stuff. I'm not against it. I don't actually have a strong opinion for or against. I do like the idea of having something that translates to C, because that opens up things like retro platforms, development, that kind of stuff. So you can write PB applications that actually let you deploy on classic Amiga or classic SNES or something like that, which is a different feature set than what modern languages seem to have. Is it something you could sell? Probably not. Would people buy it? Probably not. These are big commitment projects, and they require a lot of revisionary thinking. The first version you come up with is going to find it's limited in some ways on some destinations, and that's what happens with multi-platform in general. If you have target platforms that are 8-bit and target platforms that are 16-bit, then you have to have things that can just do your math. For example, handling strings is different. Everything is different. It's a lot of back-end. It's a lot of back-end support for fun novelty. If we did the update, the compiler process, in other words, we write a modern lexer, we split apart the grammar portion from the lexing and did that in a more modular fashion, we can pretty much do whatever we want. Yeah. And people love buzzwords. I've got to have this support and over that, and it's, well, what do you need that for? If you can't write hello world, why do you need those things? Yeah, you could do everything better. Everything could be done better. There's no question about that. I would like to have more libraries. I'd like to have more of these internal command sets be libraries. That would be my first port of call. So they're not always in the build. You could pull them in, do stuff with them, and then sort of have these are supported libraries. Well, actually, ActiveX is not supported at all. But we've kept it in the documentation. Frame sheet animation stuff. But dealing with it, just sheets of animated frames. Alternate image lighting, saving support, which is externalized. And the reason for that is you end up with these massive. There's a lot of different sub-formats of. You might think of things like JPEGs and PNGs as being one simple format. They're not. There's a whole bunch of different types of formats within them, and just including all of that can be quite bulky. That's why we have this externalized. That would be how I would tackle things in the future. You could have just these are internal libraries, but you can also have a library that's designed around making a certain type of game for a certain kind of person, right? For someone who doesn't want to do the display programming stuff, doesn't want to worry about the sounds, and just wants to get themselves to a point where they can go, I want to write the logic of my game, draw my artwork out here, and import that into here, and then just play it. So it almost becomes like a game creation tool, as opposed to a language with a bunch of libraries attached to it. That's always been the problem about trying to move to effects. Is that if you detach everything, which is what I want to do, what I have been in the process of doing all the way through, you end up with nothing. Like, you don't have any internal command sets at all, except for things like you've got the internal array commands, data commands would be there, basic math would be there, string commands, as I was saying before, would be there. Very limited functionality. Probably the time and date would be there. Things that return strings and data from the system. But you wouldn't have any way of displaying a graphic. That's supplied by the graphics library. So the start code would, in a PB project in the future, you would have this kind of, you won't see the code itself, it'll be part of the internal bindings, but basically if you build a PBFX project, you'd have in that source that's compiled before you ever see it, I'm just going to include the graphics libs, and you might have a selection here against if I don't know, graphics lib equals OpenGL, or this kind of selection where it's just including a bunch of code that has a DLL behind it in the Windows speak. For OpenGL, we want this one here, we include that in there. If we're not OpenGL, for DirectX or whatever, include the DirectX version. We can't do that with the way the compiler works at the moment. We need a bit more robustness from the compile, from the way the lexing works in the compiler. You can kind of do this sort of thing. You can have includes selectively that you choose to include or not, right? This is not something you can do, but we need a bit more support from the compiler to make this work efficiently. The include statement itself would need to be updated. We have internal source level directives and so these constants. Shouldn't use the term constant really. It kind of confuses those with PB constants. Directives are used in here. I could go, what's a constant? True. If true and if. So the compiler says that the directive evaluates the expression, and provided everything in that expression is literal, in other words, you can use PB constants and they'll resolve out to a numeric state or a string state. In this case there's no expression, so it would just go true is equal to a numeric value of 1. The expression here will get resolved and would do whatever's in the middle here. But you could actually have variables that are to do things like these graphic libraries here. These wouldn't be constants within the PB program, they would be constants or variables that the compiler or the user is declaring within the source about how the thing's to be built. It's hard to explain that, isn't it? We're sort of touching upon this other idea there is you have these directive values, and then this graphics library here, this might be an internal, so we could go maybe a different type of declaration to show that they're not part of the PB program. They have directives. This is like a variable, something, let's say. Graphics lib equals, what did I say? OpenGL. OpenGL. So the compiler would come down, see, oh, we've got a directive declaration, or maybe we go let. Probably just var or something like that. Now the compiler has this variable declared. So here we go. It's checking this thing here. This variable. Is it a compiler variable? Is it a constant? You know, something literal within the program as it's being built. These would never exist in the program. None of that would generate any code whatsoever. Whereas if this was a constant, it's actually part of the PB program. So you just went, you know, constant. Now this declaration is part of the PB program. If we want something the compiler can use to make decisions about how to build your code, we need to have variables at some point, probably some more complicated structures than that. We can't do that with the way PB works at the moment. And a bunch of other oddball stuff, like we'd love to have macros, just to mess with people's brains. Macro programming is a lot of fun, but it's also, it can be quite problematic. Which is that thing about, you know, you declare something as a macro. I don't know, my loop we'll call it. End macro. This could be just something simple as this. I'll make this nice and simple so you can sort of understand what's happening. For loop equals, say, token 1 to token 2. Then here we can have like token 1, token 2. And what happens is that when a user would place this within their program, it's like a shortcut for this loop. So you can just go 0 to 100, let's say. Now, this is not PB code. When the compiler sees this myLoop thing here, it goes, okay, I've got a macro called myLoop, cool. It has these two parameters. So it literally takes this thing here and inserts that text into here and takes the parameter, this myToken1 parameter, inserts it back into here. So you get this. In its place. You know, it sounds very simple, very dumb, but in here you might have something like, you know, if I don't know, object loop, and then end my loop, which would just be something like end if next or whatever. So the users entered something like end my loop, 0 to 100, you know, oh sorry, end my loop, print loop. Now I know that in my macro I'm using this loop counter as my variable, this variable loop as my variable counter. That's why these macros can be very confusing. They're often built to shortcut your own code, but they're hard for other people to read. You can do some really crazy stuff with it if it's implemented well. But so the output code, when the compiler says this, it would replace the first expression like that. It would be if object loop expression. The code in the middle would be here, and then end of this, you get this closing end if, and then this closing next. Now you can't really do it with functions. I mean, you can roll some functions that do that kind of stuff, but the point I'm trying to make is that as the compiler's stepping through every character on the line like this, and finds this keyword, it finds the declaration and then inserts this text in its place and then continues on. And that lets you have macros inside macros and do all kinds of wacky stuff. So you can kind of take bits of code that you find long and verbose and shorten them up, or you can make them more verbose if you wanted to. Do all kinds of weird stuff. But yeah, I love macro programming a lot. It's one of the things that as an assembly programmer you did all the time, because you had to simplify your own workflow to make this make it viable. Anyway, we have talked and talked and talked. We'll talk your ear off today. I don't have anything very definitive to tell you right now, other than life is changing. I've got some big things to make decisions upon, and that includes PlayBASIC and a bunch of other stuff I've done in the past as well. If we can make them work, fantastic. If we can't, then we might just plod along the way we've been going and be a hobby project for myself and anyone else who wants to play around with it. So I'll hang my boots up for the moment and just wish you a great start to the new year. I hope you had a good Christmas, and if you're on holidays, enjoying your holidays, have fun with that. Anyway, thanks for hanging around. Thanks for playing with PlayBASIC, and thanks for whatever happens in the future. Thanks.